big picture-wise. A lot of times we get so many small pictures, and we talk about a lot of these small pictures that we sort of miss the big picture of what's going on. And so with this, I want to go through 13 and 14 if we can. We'll make a few comments along the way, but I think it'd be better for us to we'll see a better picture if we kind of go through most of it with both chapters. But it sort of ends and really starts the theme in chapter 12. Remember, they just had victory. Saul just had victory, but it was victory that was connected to Israel's past, kind of a Sodom and Gomorrah event. Saul came in and said, hey, anybody that doesn't come fight with me, you're going to be like this ox. He cut the ox up into 12 pieces, sent it out to the 12 tribes, which is connected to Judges whenever you had the concubine that the priest cut up because the men ravaged her. And so there's a whole connection there of that, and then that's connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's really this, in that victory, there's a connection to Israel's turning away from God. But God gave them victory over the Philistines, and so you sort of feel this victorious moment, but Samuel kind of comes back in here and really brings us God's view of it in saying, you guys wanted a king, and God gave you a king, which was an evil thing because God was your king. And however, in relation to that, keep God's commandments, which again, the whole law is transcendent in love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. So whenever you hear that, especially in the Old Testament, don't think of keep the 10 Commandments, be morally good. That's not what they're saying, okay? When Jesus interpreted and gave for them what is the law, and even the religious leaders knew this, what was the law? The answer was love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all your mind, all of your soul, all of your strength. So what can happen is when you start reading that, like where we ended, where Samuel says, look, God gave you a king, the king you asked for, a king who is like you. You wanted a king who looked like you. God gave you that. But if you keep the commandments, God will still extend to you mercy in relation to the king that He gave you. So again, don't think, be morally upright. No, love the Lord your God. In other words, have God come back and God be your king. So even if you've got an earthly king, God is the king who's over that king. So as you're responding in relation to this king that you've got here on earth, understand that it's God who has given you this king and can work through that king if you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength. See, man looks for a perfect leader. It's in us. Looks for the perfect leader that's going to fix all of their problems. There is no such thing. There is no such thing. And so, that kind of, when you look at that, it's kind of like you say, well, how is that? I mean, it's this roller coaster ride. How is it that you come in here and you've got a people who reject God as their king and say, we want a king because Samuel's sons are wicked. We want a king. Well, okay, that doesn't work because you already had Eli who had 2 sons who were wicked, and Samuel came from that environment. So you don't have an excuse there. You've already seen God work through this type of a circumstance before and bringing you a righteous leader named Samuel who loves God and led you well. So you can't check that box off. No, you wanted a king to be like all the other nations. You wanted a king because you did not want me as God your king. I gave you Saul. Saul, his first victory is connected to Israel's worst time. But they're all happy because they got this earthly victory. Well, how does God see that? And last week, Samuel comes in here and says, it doesn't matter God gave you an earthly victory. God does that of His own. God does not need man to do that. That's why in between the Saul becoming king, in between Eli and the fall of his sons and the rise of Saul, you've got God who is showing that he does not need any help in having victory over the Philistines. He doesn't need numbers. He doesn't need numbers. So then there's this external showing of the heart of Israel. You wanted a king because you want to be like all the other nations. You don't want God to be your king. And one of the things that we said last week is, that's the problem that man has. And when I say man, I'm talking about us. We want to be king. We want to be God. We want to dictate terms. And that's sad because it's choosing a lesser. None of us can look around and say, when has God not been great to us? When has God not been a great king to rule over us? So why is it we don't want to submit to God? Well, here's the answer. Because we don't love God. We don't love God. And when I say love God, what I mean by that is we don't desire God as our greatest love. See, a lot of times when you see in the New Testament, you say, if Christ says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. We get this feeling of guilt that says, well, I don't keep God's commandments, so I don't love God. It's really not what he's talking about there in terms of the heart of that. What he says is what naturally overflows from a person who loves and desires someone is a following them in terms of their commandments, their ways. So when you're not doing these things, what it's really showing is you don't desire and love God. He's not your truest love, your purest form of love. Okay? So Samuel calls them out on all of this, and then God shows himself through the destruction of crops, which is a curse to the covenant. And the people are feared and repent in the sense of, we've done wrong, save us, save us, save us. And then Samuel comes back and says, look, if you will love God, you're going to be all right, even with Saul as your king. Okay, if you love God, it's going to be all right, even with Saul as your king. So what is that? Because sometimes we think about that in its superficial terms, okay? What is that? Because he says in 12, when they asked to repent, verse 19, the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God so that we may not die. That's 12:19. For we have added to all of our sins by asking for ourselves a king. Samuel said to the people, don't fear. You've committed all this evil, yet don't turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all of your heart. You must not turn aside, for then you would go after futile things which cannot profit or deliver because they're futile. For the Lord will not abandon his people. Why? On account of his great name. Why is it that we have the security of the believer? My security does not rest in my ability to constantly be faithful to God. It's in God being faithful to his name. So because God is faithful to his name, he draws me to him, and I rest in that security. And when I see myself not being drawn to him, I confess that, agree with God in relation to that, and understand that I fall under God's grace. Proper fear of God causes you to draw to God. It doesn't push you away from God. So a proper fear of God, and I don't mean just respect, I mean all that God is, does not, for a Christian, does not push him away from God, but draws him to God. Why? Because you understand that God's greatness rests in his character, his integrity, and his nature. When God says he's going to do something, he's going to follow through on it. Well, God says, I'm going to uphold my name and my people so they can rest in that, because God's going to do what he said he's going to do. And so he brings them back to that. So, because the Lord has been pleased to make a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and right way. Now, catch 24, and you want to make sure you underline it and put your asterisks by it. Do whatever you got to do, because 24 is key in understanding what's wrong with chapter 13 and 14. Okay? You're not going to understand the story if you don't catch that. He says, fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all of your heart. How do you do that? How do you fear the Lord and serve Him with all of your heart? How do you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, mind, soul, and strength? Consider, look at the rest of it, consider what great things He has done for you. Now, what is the greatness that God has done for this people at this time? And the answer to that is, number one, He hasn't given them all that they deserve. They asked for an earthly king. Did He give them an earthly king? Yes, He did, but He said He will still save them through that earthly king if they continue and move to love Him. The second thing that He has done is shown that He doesn't need a king for Him to be king. What I mean by that is numbers don't matter. That is going to be key to understanding 13 and 14. Consider what great things God has done for you. So far, God has delivered you without numbers. He hasn't needed huge, mighty armies to deliver you. Okay? And so they have the availability to still show Hesed love, loyal love to God through all of that's fixing to come if they stop and they consider all that God's done for them. Now, what this means is for us in relation to trials that are testings that are going to come to us through our windshield, they're still ahead of us. What does this mean? It means for us to live well through those testings that are going to come from, and we're going to see through that front windshield, for us to look back in the rearview mirror and consider all of the goodness down the road that God's taken us. And if you don't keep that always from the back of your mind and move it to the forefront of your mind, you're not going to move forward well. Okay? You can stop a huge amount of your stress and anxiety if you just consider all of the great things God's done for you. Because one of the major strategies of Satan is to get you to look away from the abundance of the things in which God's provided for you and look at the prohibitions, the hardships, the trials, the stressors that God's put in your life. And when Satan and flesh causes you to do that, it feels like it's only 1 degree off, but you go through miles and you miss the island. You totally miss the island. So you always have to keep in the forefront of your mind when you feel yourself having that oppression, stop. What my life up to this point, how has God worked, and how is it that I should consider the great things that God has done for me? Okay, now keep that in the forefront of my mind as we move forward, okay? And if they do that, they've got a chance to show covenantal love towards God, okay? So, but if you act wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. 13. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. An easy way to think about this is you're going to have kind of a 40-year span of Saul that you're going to get some insight into. You're going to have about 40 years of David that we're going to get some insight into, and then you're going to have 40 years of Solomon that you're going to get insight into, and then you're going to have this huge turnover of kings because of what Proverbs talks about. When the wickedness rules the land, you flow through leaders, okay? And so we're getting this insight now into what's this era of Saul look like in relation to his people and then how God's dealing with his people, okay? Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibya of Benjamin. But he sent the rest of the people each to his tent. Okay, so you got 3,000 men, 2 with Saul, 1's going to go with Jonathan. Okay, now through this, we're going to have to stop and look at, most time this isn't considered, what's the contrast between Saul and Jonathan? What does Saul look like? What does Jonathan look like? How does Saul respond to things? How does Jonathan respond to things? Okay? Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Gibya. The Philistines heard of it. Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. All of Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines. Okay, now you first look at that, you're like, okay, hold on just a second. Jonathan just had victory. You know, you ever heard the saying, you know, he's good at tooting his own horn? You know, it probably came from here. You know, Saul tooted his horn, and everybody says, Saul brought us great victory. And Jonathan's looking around saying, do what? The victories of armies are going to be attributed to the kings. Okay? Now, stop and think about it, though, in relation to kings that are coming up and even battles that have happened before, but the kings that have come up, when you have kings who, let's take David, for example. David's got a bunch of great leaders, right? And there's a huge amount of armies that are waging war, but you never hear about those leaders. All you hear about is David led them to war, right? Remember when Moses was going to battle, and the narrative was surrounded Moses. In other words, the spotlight was pointing to Moses. Keeps his arms up, they win. As soon as his arms go down, they began to lose. But who was fighting the battle? You remember? God was, but through who? What leader? Do you remember? Joshua. So you get this just little hint, you know, of Joshua that, you know, he's out there battling because God's sort of in the background training Joshua for what's to come. But the spotlight's on Moses. Well, here, that's not going to be the case in this. You got a spotlight that's on Saul, and you've got a spotlight that's on Jonathan. And it's saying, let's look at Saul. Let's see how he's dealing with these things. Let's look at Jonathan, and let's look at how he's dealing with these things. Who has the greater army, Saul or Jonathan? Saul does, but who brings victory? Saul, the scripture said, Samuel told that you are king, do everything that God has shown your hand to do, which is what? Go to battle with the Philistines. Who's at battle here with the Philistines? Saul or Jonathan? Who should be at battle with the Philistines? Saul. But Jonathan gets victory, Saul blows the trumpet, and Saul gets credit. And this is a little bitty, good movies give you little hints of things that are fixing to come later. Is Saul a person, if you know Saul's life, is Saul a person who has trouble when other people get credit for his things that he feels like should come to him? He's gonna, isn't he? He's gonna. So, the people were then summoned to Saul at Gilgal. Now, verse 5, the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel, 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. They came up and camped in Michmash, east of Bethaven. Big, mighty army. That's a bad dude right there, group that's coming up against them. Because you're talking 36,000 just of their armor. So they're just saying they've got 30,000 it'd be like us saying they've got 30,000 tanks, right? And they've got 6,000 missile stations plus men. So it's a big dude that's coming out against them. All right. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were hard pressed, then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets, in cliffs, in cellars, and in pits. And also some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. But as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people following him trembling. Now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. Now, stop just a second, because we can check the box and say, duh, you got 36,000 of armor coming against you plus men, duh. But what has God shown Israel? He's shown, do numbers matter with God? They don't. And Saul is their leader. His hand is supposed to be doing what? Fighting Philistines. But what do you find? That's not what they're doing. That's not what they're doing. They see this army, and he's going to find some more baggage to hide behind. And all the people are too. So Saul is not a character that is instilling confidence in people. Why is he not instilling confidence in people? The answer to that is because Saul is not confident in God. See, if I'm going to try and instill confidence in you, or I'm going to try and instill confidence in my kids, you can either try and instill that confidence as far as your human strength will go, or you can have supernatural strength that portrays and shows true confidence because you have confidence in God. Now, the distinction and difference in that is, if you've got, hey, we can handle this, we can do this, we can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, we've got this, we can do this, we can do all this humanistic stuff that you've got going on today. If you have a victory, who gets victory? You do. I'm now king, I'm now God. But if you go to that group and you go to your family, you go to your kids and you say, look, this will work out. It will work out exactly as God has planned it to work out. And we can have confidence in the God in whom we love in this situation. Your confidence doesn't have to be in me. Your confidence needs to be in the God who is over me. Right? Well, that's a different deal. So, but you don't see this with Saul. Right here, what do you see with Saul? They're retreating. Now, a person could easily check that off and say, well, yeah, anybody would. A person who has God is not just anybody. Israel is not just anybody. They are who? They're chosen people of God. Now, you stop and you fast forward that to the New Testament. You have the power of God present, His presence residing within you. Why are you acting like you're just anybody? Why are you making excuses for all this stuff, humanistic thought? Well, a lot of times it's because we rest within ourselves. I'm not king. God is king. Okay? So it's easy to say, well, Saul should have done this, Saul should have done that. Yeah, right. He should have. But so should you and I. So should you and I. So he waits. Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. So Saul said, bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offering, and he offered the burnt offering. Does Saul have the right to do that? No, he does not. Saul is a king. He's not a priest. He doesn't have the right to do that. Now, this is interesting because some of this shows what happens when we are faced with stressors that cause us to become dependent upon ourselves rather than dependence upon God. A lot of times we move in the wrong direction. if Saul is supposed to be doing what God has commanded him to do, his fight should be with the Philistines in the strength that God has provided, even though the numbers are not in his favor. But numbers don't matter for Saul because God doesn't need numbers. But instead, he is in flight away from the battle that God's called him to, but he goes to where he thinks he can find strength within himself. So I need God. I can't take flight from God, but I don't trust in God enough to go to the battle. So what do? You do what you feel like you can control within a realm that still feels spiritual. It still feels religious. This is why the first time startled me when you see them make the golden calf. And right after you see them make the golden calf, you expect them to act like Egypt. But what do they say? Let us have a festival unto the Lord, Yahweh. Do what? You're going to make a golden calf that God's commanded you not to make, but then you're going to go with that festival and that calf, and you're not going to say, let's go to the pagan gods of Egypt. You're going to say, let's have a festival unto the Lord. And you know what the answer is? That's right. You know why? Because there's always this mixture that a man feels like has to happen. I can do a little bit of this with God, because I can't flee God because then it's against me, but I'm going to take this little extra mesh of myself and insert that, and then when I mix those two things, everything's going to be okay. No. It's like mixing cyanide with your food. God says, yeah, I don't need you to begin with. So this when a time of testing comes, you got to be careful. Because a lot of times the thing that we flee from, the thing that God's called us to, let's just talk about if it's a man with his family. One of the easiest things for a man with his family to do is negate his responsibilities and shrink back within himself and then be powerful in a different way under the name of God. Right? Rather than face the hardships that he has to face in leading his family through hard times, because that's where God's called him to, but he looks at that and it's daunting and he says, I don't see how I can do that. And God says, that's right, without me you can't. Which should cause him, that fear should cause him to fall on his face before God and say, my confidence, if you don't show up, I die. And lead his family that way. But a lot of times that's not what happens. He takes flight from that, but then he takes things that he thinks he can control and works through those other things while still grabbing his Bible and adding a verse or two here that says we're really godly in these things. God says, no. This happens a lot. And so Saul's taking on responsibility that's not his responsibility while he's shrieking responsibility that's his to steward. Okay? So when you're facing this, how is it that God's blessed me? What is it that God's called me to? And then what is the testing that I have to face in the strength that God provides? And what is it that I have to be careful of not to take flight from? Because when I'm taking flight from that, I am fleeing towards something else that's not mine to be responsible for and of. Guess then what happens? I start taking on responsibilities and stewardships that aren't mine to take on, and then I look up and I say, where am I? Where am I? What am I doing? What am I doing? And that's what Saul's finding himself in. So this is very common to even the Christian life and how this works out. So as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel came, Saul went out to meet and greet him. So notice, if 7 days is the day that we're going to do it, sun comes up, 7th day, Samuel's not here, Saul's in a panic, Saul says, let's break out the burnt offerings, Samuel hasn't showed up. But he no more gets the meat cooked, and guess who comes over the hill? Yeah, which means more than likely this is still on the 7th day. Yep, this is still on the 7th day, more than likely. Samuel says, verse 11, "What have you done?" Saul said, "Because I saw the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I've not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself. I didn't want to do it, Samuel. I really didn't. You know, I really didn't. But you didn't show up. You know, Samuel, if you'd have showed up, when Adam and Eve is in the garden and God comes to Adam, what does Adam do? And what does Eve do? It's an interesting storyline, because when God comes to Adam, Adam points to Eve. God moves to Eve. Eve points to the serpent. God goes to the serpent, and it stops there, and there's this battle in between the serpent and God. Serpent did what the serpent knows he did. That's right. But Adam and Eve don't take responsibility for what they've done. And so then it goes to what? It goes from serpent, then it goes boom, and it goes boom. Why? Because you can point your finger away, but who I always say this, when we face God in relation to the stewardship of our lives, I don't know if we are going to feel tempted to do this. There's going to be part of me that says that we may still feel tempted to do that. There ain't going to be nobody there to point to. There ain't going to be nobody there to point to. Jen and I have been married 25 plus years. I ain't going to have her to point to. And she's not going to have me to point to. Because we're all called to steward our own stuff. Right? So what does Saul do when he's confronted with this? Samuel. And really it's interesting, because when Adam does that, when he says what? You remember the way Adam said that? That woman you gave me. So really, he's not really pointing to Eve. You know who he's really pointing to? God, if you'd have done this different, it's your fault. Yeah, that's right. My side is sore because you ripped it off, yeah. If you stop and think about the God who just created you, you just blamed Him for your sin. It's amazing that God didn't just look at him and, like Superman, burn him in half. Aaron did the same thing. Yeah. So, really, he's looking back at God's appointed person. He's saying, you did it. But see, Adam can't say, God, you did it. No, it's the woman that you gave me. That sounds a whole lot better than God, you did it. It's a whole lot better for Saul to say, if you'd have been here at the point in time, it would have been okay, than it is to say, God didn't have you show up in time. It's God's fault. But in essence, that's what you're saying, right? So, he said, I forced myself. Verse 13, Samuel said to Saul, you've acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. See, that's what he just got through saying at the end of chapter 12, wasn't it? Keep the commandment of the Lord your God, and what? All will go well. He says, first act after that, you didn't do that. You didn't do that. Which he commanded you. For now, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept the Lord what the Lord commanded you. And we'll talk about more about later that a man after his own heart, because when you hear that, what do you know? What immediately comes to mind? David immediately comes to mind. So we'll unpack that later on. Samuel arose. Here's why I say we're going to unpack that later on. Because if you stop and read this story not knowing what's going to happen next, you know who you would think that man would be? If you didn't, let's say David doesn't show up. Let's just act as if David doesn't show up. Who would you think the man after his own heart would be? Jonathan. You watch how Jonathan acts throughout this whole thing. He is the contrast to Saul.
I was thinking about how amazing it really is. Eli had two sons. Eli was a very godly man. Two sons were worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Samuel was a very godly man. Two sons were any good.
Yep.
Saul, just the opposite. And he's got a son that's perfect.
The Proverbs, which shows us that it's normative. What shows us as normal, is train up a child in the way he should go. When he's old, he'll not depart from it. That's not a promise. It's a proverb which says this is the normal way in which God works. When he's bringing out these stories, like what Dad mentioned, there's almost good storylines bring up several. You've got 15 different characters, and there's something going on with every character, and then the whole storyline is moving all of these characters through all of that. One of the things that through all these characters that we're seeing is man wants to love man. Man wants to put man on too big of a pedestal. Man wants to believe that man can do it apart from God. And one of the storylines that you see in relation to family is that godly leaders don't dictate whether or not you have godly children. It's amazing. Eli was wicked and his sons were wicked. Samuel is righteous and his sons were wicked. And you don't get the idea that Samuel opposed God like Eli did. The narrative shows that God came onto Eli and says, you didn't act with your kids the way that you should have, therefore both your kids are going to die on the same day and you're going to know it's me. He is hard because you didn't put me first. He is hard on Eli. Eli's fat and heavy. Why? Because he's taking some off the fork too. So you're kind of like, yeah, okay, I can make that work. But then when you see Samuel, you're kind of like, God never says anything to Samuel that he didn't try and do all that he could to raise up these two kids the way that they should be raised up. And yet his two kids turned out the way that he did. Samuel is part of a bigger narrative though, isn't he? Israel should see what happened with those two sons and look at Eli and say, if God can do it through a wicked man and his two sons, he can do it right now with a good man whose two sons went astray. That's not a big leap. That's a step that God could work through that, but they don't. So then we move over to say, well, clearly there's a one-to-one correlation towards a parent and his child, and then Saul shows up. And Saul is going south, left, and right. And what's his son? His son is upright as the day is long. One of the things that showed me, especially in student ministry, that I pounded them kids on. I mean, you talk about kick a dead horse. That thing was stinking by the time I was through. You cannot blame your circumstances for where you stand in life. And those kids were going through a lot harder stuff than what our kids probably went through. But I used it on my two. Pastors' kids, they're gonna be rebellious. I told them at a young age, you two don't come to me with that excuse, boy. You don't see in this Bible where anybody can use their parents as an excuse as to why they turned out the way they did. And if you do, you're blaming God. So you steward your life. You steward your life. And don't you tell me that you can't turn out right or well. Don't you let that thought sneak in on the back door, because everybody said, preacher kid's going to be rebellious, preacher kid's going to be rebellious, preacher kid's going to be rebellious, so I have the right to be rebellious. Don't you think that that's going to work in this house? Why? Because the Bible doesn't show that out. It doesn't show that out. And you're right. It causes you to stop and say, what? But see, then you go to the Proverbs with that balances it, and it's a great proverb. Everybody uses it, right? Blessed is he whose quiver is full. He's talking about kids there. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full. He goes on in that same chapter, not very many verses later after that, and he says a verse that we take out of context. He says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who labor in. What house is he talking about? He ain't talking about your brick and mortar. He ain't talking about your business. He ain't talking about your livelihood. What house is he talking about? He's talking about them kids that he just got through speaking of. The person who is building that house has to be dependent upon God just like everybody else. It's got to be dependent upon God just like everybody else. And so that's one of these things that's carrying through this current in this narrative. You've got a dad, Saul, who is pointing, and ultimately he's pointing to God saying, it's your problem, it's your fault. Samuel should have showed up. Samuel, you should have showed up on time. Samuel doesn't take it. Samuel's not like Eli. Samuel doesn't take it. What you've done is foolish. God would have established your kingdom. He established your kingdom. And as it is, it ain't going to happen. This is wild because then when you look at Jonathan, as we go through with Jonathan, we're going to look at Jonathan and we're going to say, did Jonathan know that? Does Jonathan ever seem like the person who is pressing to inherit a kingdom? Not according to his dad, he's not. But what is dad going to do? What's King Saul doing continually? He's trying to push on, why is it you don't want this kingdom? Why is it you don't want this kingdom? Well, Saul's pushing back against God here already, whenever God then dictates that this kingdom isn't going to stay with him. Yeah, it's pretty intense. So, because you've not kept what the Lord commanded you, verse 14. Verse 15, Samuel arose, went up from Gilgal to Gibya, Benjamin. Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men.
Isn't that the same number David had with him when he ran?
Well, that number is going to come up again later, but if we think about it in context of chapter 12, when he says, stop and look in your rearview mirror as to how God has blessed you in order for you to keep His commandments. Okay, so let's pause right here and say, God's told them, testing trial is going to come ahead of you, so you better stop and consider how God has taken care of you in the past. So let's stop and consider, how has God taken care of them in the past as it relates to their enemy in relation to war? Has God ever led them into battle outnumbered? Who? Specifically, what judge? Yeah, Caleb, I was thinking earlier, but Gideon. What was the big point God made with Gideon? You've got too many people. 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 If you go into battle with this many people, you're going to think that you had victory. You've got too many people. And how many does he take? Half of the number that's still with Saul. Why is it that Saul should come in here and say, numbers don't matter? Numbers don't matter. But he numbered the people, and when you number the people, you're trying to see how strong you are. He numbered the people, and he comes up with 600. Was that more than enough for him to have confidence in going to battle against a mighty army? It should be. Why? But why should it be? Because it's not the number. It's God.
David, when he had to number the people and look what it cost him.
When he numbered the people, what he's doing is he's wanting to see how strong he is to go conquer more. Battle is the Lord's, trusting in God. Dave.
Is this why constantly it talks about the numbers being as many as the sand on the seashore without being specific?
Yes. Yes.
You've got more than enough, always. It's always more than enough. God can handle.
Yes. There has been such a constant current that God has brought them through, that he does this all the time in his economy. I've given you more than enough information for you to be able to have confidence and trust in me. I've worked in your life more than enough in more than enough ways for you to understand what's going on here that from a human perspective looks impossible, but you know it's not because of where I've taken you. You've gone down a road that others haven't gone down before. So when they're bringing these things up, he's bringing them up because he's saying, look, I've provided a pattern for you. That pattern that I've given for you is to instill confidence in you, not in yourselves, but in me. This is the way I'm working in relation to your life. So with Israel's history, it is so explicit in the Exodus. God's continually showing the Egyptians, I am a greater God than you are. Plague, 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 plague. Could God have done it in one fell swoop? Absolutely. But he's doing all of these plagues because he is showing the entire world, I am greater than the gods of Egypt. There are no gods of any kind. He takes them out. Could have saved them, and Egypt could have said, I am so glad to see you in the rearview mirror. But God works in the heart of Pharaoh to say, what is it that we've done? We got to go chase after them. Takes the mightiest army in Israel's most vulnerable time and chases them. Why does God do that? God has a much bigger picture than what we have. Israel has to know if God, through not lifting up one hand, can destroy the mightiest army in the world with the Red Sea, they can always trust him in relation to the battles that he presents before them. It's your history. It's where I brought you from. And so, this is you're right, this is a continuation of that. Oh my gosh, if you just would look at this one event, okay, let's read the Bible, new Christian, read the Bible, first time, take it to this event. That new Christian is going to say, I do just exactly like Saul would do. And we should see within our flesh, I have the tendency to want to do that as well. But we then, as we mature in the faith, we should say, but I shouldn't respond that way. Why? Because I know God's history with Israel. I know the legacy that God's left with Israel. So this is saying something bigger. What it's saying in relation to this is, numbers don't matter with God. You've got a lesser in Jonathan who took a lesser army who took over a Philistine garrison. Saul's picture is one of flight. And he takes on responsibility that's not his to take on. And then after all of that and this interaction with Saul, you just miraculously have Saul numbering the people, and you just all of a sudden have this number 600 come out, which just so happens to be twice as much as what God used with Gideon. When God was lowering the number with Gideon, he got through round 2, and Gideon's got to be looking around saying, there ain't that many people around here. And God says, no, it's still too many. So in this case, if this would transcend to Gideon, God would look at 600 and he would say, no, Saul, you think that's not enough. I think it's too many.
And God always uses the craziest means that you would never think that he would use to destroy. Take Samson takes his jawbone of it off.
Yeah, yeah,
Goes ahead with Gideon. Goes ahead and tells him to take a torch
torch and a light.
vessel.
Yeah,
It's just that way all the way through.
yeah.
It is just so ridiculous by man.
Okay, so I'm going to get off on a tangent right now, okay? I'm just going to get off and I'm warning you, this is just a little tangent of mine. Right now, people look in the world today and they say, preppers, let's go defend ourselves. Let's, make bunkers and let's da-da-da-da-da, and let's da-da-da-da-da, and let's da-da-da-da-da. And I think to myself, okay, so we're going to do this when today's technology, we have homeowners that can buy thermal imaging that looks through houses and finds people. Homeowners own that. What do you think the military owns? And, your gun case is going to defend yourself against all of that. And you guys know, I don't want to get in a big gun debate and everything else. I'm not against guns and I'm not against any of that. We've got gun cases and we've got all that. But my point is, that's just like us, isn't it? I want to make sure I defend myself. Folks, I'm going to live as long on this earth as what God calls me to live, and my faith and confidence in God. And if something or someone takes me, it's going to be because God has said, this is your time for purposes that I have for you. That does not mean that when we are living in a great place and a great time that gives us the right to vote for the freedoms that we have, that we shouldn't do that. And the means that God's given us to do that. I don't mean any of those things. But I am not dependent and trusting in those things to save me. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm an alien, a foreigner on this earth for this appointed time. So we're not going to get through 14, which is okay. Which is okay. We'll stop at 16 and we'll start up there. Okay? All right, let's pray. Father God, grateful for this day, grateful for just the truths that come out through your word and all these things. Such great, you show yourself to be so great. And it is just such high treason for us to turn away from you. And what great love you have for us in continually just pulling us back to you. You are such an amazing, great God. And we can confess, Father, that we just do not love you as we ought. It does not mean we don't love you and don't desire to love you more. It's just when we see these things, we just all confess that we don't love you as we ought. For you are an incredibly great and blessed God. And so my prayer, God, is that where we see our failure, it doesn't cause us to flee, but it causes us just to really embody your greatness even more. Because you desire for that distinction between us and you to draw us to you, not to push us away from you. And so, Father, where we see that great divide between us and you, may it just cause us to see the greatness of the bridge that you've crossed and that barrier to bring us to you. And you are an incredibly great God, worthy to be praised with the totality of our love, our loyalty, and everything that we say and do. May we each day and the rest of this week live that way. These things we pray in your Son's holy name. Amen.